film about the death of legacy media, produced as a legacy IP, starring characters who already said goodbye. The Devil Wears Prada 2 recycles its predecessor while accidentally arguing against its own existence. And this weekend, we're going to make it a $100 million movie anyway. I offer this as a diagnosis. The question at the center of this essay concerns cost. What does it cost us, narratively, emotionally, and culturally, when a sequel cannot commit to its own thesis? When a film critiques the very forces that produced it, without ever recognizing that it is one of those same forces. This is the legacy sequel trap, and The Devil Wears Prada 2 may be the most complete expression yet. To understand why The Devil Wears Prada 2 fails on a structural level, we first have to understand, with real precision, where the 2006 original succeeded. The first one was better, functions as a feeling. Feelings without structure remain nostalgia, so let's set the stage with exactly what that film accomplished and why it accomplished it so cleanly. The engine of The Devil Wears Prada was Andy's internal transformation, particularly the moment when the transformation becomes indistinguishable from her corruption. Yes, the clothes mattered. The fashion world's particular brand of cruelty mattered, rendered with extraordinary precision. Meryl Streep's performance as Miranda Priestley mattered, a performance so controlled, so icily specific, that it almost operates on a different frequency than the rest of the film. Beneath all of those elements ran the real Andy's transformation, and the moment it shaded into corruption. When Miranda dresses Andy down over a lumpy blue sweater during what the original screenplay calls the cerulean monologue, she is doing something larger than cruelty. Cruelty would be too small an explanation for what is happening in that scene. She is proving that Andy's dismissal of the fashion industry, her smug confidence that she is too intelligent, too serious, and too real to be touched by something as frivolous as a trickled-down color palette, is itself a form of arrogance. Andy's contempt for the world she has entered is ignorance, not discernment. Miranda sees through it immediately. Andy, to her credit, eventually does too. That is what the film is actually about. It concerns the particular psychological violence that occurs when someone who believes they are above a world is forced to learn that world's language fluently. To survive in Miranda's orbit, Andy must adapt, must absorb the vocabulary, the aesthetics, the instincts, and the moral compromises of a place she privately despises. The film's central tension, the thing that gives it genuine dramatic weight, is whether adapting to that language means losing the self that existed before. Miranda herself functions as something more than an antagonist. She is, as is often the case in classic storytelling, a dark mirror. She's a glimpse of the logical conclusion of Andy's trajectory if she follows this path to its end. A woman of extraordinary competence, ruthless creative vision, and absolute, total isolation. Miranda functions as a warning. The film understands this, which is why the most important scene in the entire movie is the limo scene that precedes Andy throwing her phone in the Paris fountain. When Miranda tells Andy everybody wants to be us, she is confessing. She is telling Andy that the price of becoming everything the world wants you to be is that you cannot afford the luxury of wanting anything for yourself. Andy's horror in that moment is recognition. She sees herself in what Miranda has become. This is what makes that scene the emotional core of the entire film. When Andy throws her phone in the fountain, it matters because she earned her place in that world before rejecting it. She walked away from something she mastered. That distinction is everything here. Meaningful rejection requires inhabiting a world first. Real sacrifice requires the capacity to stay. The arc reaches completion and genuine satisfaction because Andy has become capable of staying before she chooses to leave. That is a closed loop, a completed character arc with internal logic, emotional stakes, and a resolution that costs the protagonist something real. Andy Sachs, in the summer of 2006, earned her ending. She paid for it. And the film trusted us to recognize that the cost was what made it meaningful. Which brings us to 2026. A legacy sequel is defined by a specific structural problem. It is a follow-up made decades after the original, bringing back classic characters in a contemporary setting. There is a fault line built into the very architecture of this format, one that most studios either cannot see or have decided is not worth addressing. If a character learned their lesson in the first movie, what do they do in the second? If Andy Sachs walked away from Miranda Priestley because she had the clarity to recognize what staying would cost her, if that choice was the entire emotional point of the original film, then what story exactly justifies bringing her back? What new problem can she face that both honors the growth she achieved and generates sufficient dramatic conflict to sustain a new narrative? This is the question. The way a filmmaker answers it, or fails to answer it, separates a legacy sequel that works from one that does not? For most studios, the answer is devastatingly simple. You make the character unlearn their lesson. You regress them. You hit the reset button. In The Devil Wears Prada 2, Miranda Priestley conveniently pretends not to remember Andy Sachs. The forgetting operates as pure structural necessity, lacking the internal logic of a character beat or the dramatic weight of a deliberate power move that the film then interrogates. The forgetting exists because remembering would make the original relational dynamic impossible to recreate. And the relational dynamic from the original film is what the studio is selling. So the film simply erases Miranda's memory of someone who, by any reasonable dramatic logic, should have been one of the most memorable employees she ever had. The awe is restored, the hierarchy is reinstated. Andy is once again in the position of the unproven assistant reaching for approval she already earned, and already consciously discarded 2 decades earlier. Emily's arc cuts even closer to the bone. Emily Charlton's arc in the 2006 film ends somewhere quietly unremarkable. These are 2 women who spent most of the movie undermining each other with practiced viciousness, competing for proximity to a woman who treats both of them as interchangeable instruments. Their relationship was defined by mutual contempt, professional rivalry, and the particular cruelty that emerges when 2 people are fighting over the same limited resource. By the end of the original film, something subtly shifts. It arrives quietly, through a recognition that they survived the same crucible and were shaped by it in the same ways. But, in the sequel, that arc is erased. Emily is an antagonist again, brittle, obstructive, operating as mere plot function. The fully realized person who should have lived through the 20 years between these 2 films is absent. The mutual recognition that the original earned over 96 minutes of careful character work is simply deleted, because the sequel needs dramatic friction, and Emily, reduced now to her most antagonistic qualities, is the most convenient source of it. 20 years of implied growth, reduced to a function. This structural collapse is not merely part of this film, though. It's a pandemic, recurring across recent legacy sequels. In Star Wars The Force Awakens, for example, Han Solo's arc across the original trilogy, from selfish mercenary rogue to selfless caring general willing to sacrifice himself for a cause larger than his own, is quietly, almost casually undone. He's just a smuggler again, estranged from Leia and running from his past. The filmmakers understood that the audiences wanted the roguish, charming Han Solo they fell in love with in 1977. They understood it so completely that they were willing to pay for that version of Han with everything the intervening 38 years of storytelling had built. In Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, we open with Indy alone, broken, stripped of the relationships and victories the series spent 4 films accumulating. The vibrancy, the competence, the infectious enthusiasm that made him one of cinema's most beloved characters, all gone, replaced with a hollow figure waiting to die. The filmmakers apparently believed that aging a hero into ruin constituted sufficient dramatic depth. The actual result took everything the audience had invested in this character and used it as raw material for a tone poem about disappointment. Jurassic World asks us to accept that humanity, having watched 2 separate parks dissolve into chaos and mass death, looked at that track record and decided the answer was a 3rd park. The actual reason for that decision was franchise mechanics. The studio needed an excuse to show us dinosaurs in an amusement park setting again. No character in the narrative makes a compelling argument for why this time it would be different, and they never could. The nostalgia was the story, but the regression was the logic behind that story. Some of the filmmakers in these cases are highly competent. Some of them are genuinely talented. This is a systemic problem that goes beyond any of them. It emerges from a specific misunderstanding of what audiences are actually responding to when they express nostalgia. Studios misunderstand and interpret nostalgia as a desire to see exactly what existed before. The same characters, the same dynamics, and the same emotional textures. Nostalgia itself is a stranger thing. Nostalgia is grief with a particular kind of sweetness attached to it. It's the recognition that something you loved was real, and that it existed in a specific moment that can never be fully recovered. What audiences actually want from a legacy sequel is the acknowledgement that the moment mattered, and the intelligence to understand that the passage of time has changed both the characters and the people watching them. When studios hit that reset button, they're demonstrating that they did not understand what made the original valuable in the first place. This is where The Devil Wears Prada 2 becomes something more than a simple example of structural failure. This is where it becomes genuinely fascinating, and, depending on your threshold for this kind of irony, maybe a little bit devastating. The plot of The Devil Wears Prada 2 is about Runway magazine facing obsolescence. Miranda Priestley, the woman who once represented the absolute summit of cultural authority, The woman whose opinion can make a designer's career or end it with a single exhaled syllable is in a rearguard battle against corporate interests that want to replace human creative judgment with algorithmic efficiency. The film is, at its structural core, a story about what happens when legacy means nothing anymore. When the institutions that shape culture are hollowed out by financial logic. When the things we built with care and vision are dismantled by people who understand markets, but don't understand meaning all that well. The film is very explicitly and unsubtly arguing that the world loses something irreplaceable when it substitutes corporate calculation for genuine creative vision. And then, the film itself suffers from that exact substitution. The visual language is looser, the emotional core is a little less precise, the editing rhythms that gave the 2006 film its particular tension, the way it could make the arrival of a dry cleaning order feel like a military operation, are absent. The filmmakers retain their technical skill. The conditions under which the film was made simply did not demand that level of specificity from the 2006 film was made by people trying to prove something. 20 years later, the 2026 film was made under very different conditions, by people merely replicating. And that difference is visible in every frame. Alright, set the visual inconsistency aside, and we're going to talk a little bit of spoilers here, because the primary failure is the ending. The climax of the film arrives in a single scene. Sasha Barnes, a billionaire investor played by Lucy Liu, intervenes to save Runway. She writes the check. The magazine is preserved. The legacy is protected. The narrative resolved without any complication. Roll credits. Let's just sit with that for a moment, okay? A film that opens by arguing that billionaires are destroying legacy creative work resolves itself by having a billionaire save legacy creative work in a single scene. The scene's just a mechanism, a sudden resolution dropped into the runtime to close the narrative problem the film spent 90 minutes constructing. A character who exists almost entirely to serve as that mechanical resolution. The 2006 film would have refused this ending. The original Devil Wears Prada took an unsentimental view of institutions. It believed that magazines, and any creative enterprise, get survived by individuals with the clarity and courage to leave them. Its entire emotional logic ran on the axis of personal choice. When Andy walks away from Miranda, she rescues herself. The sequel's ending completely contradicts its own thesis, along with the thesis of the original film, to justify this sequel's existence. It takes the specific worldview that made the 2006 movie resonate and replaces it with a precise, narrative-level structure that the worldview was meant to resist. This is what I mean by the meta-tragedy of The Devil Wears Prada 2. It cannot see itself clearly enough to recognize that its existence is the one thing it's arguing against. This is a film that diagnoses a cultural disease while presenting as one of its most visible symptoms. It critiques the erasure of genuine creative vision and then demonstrates that erasure in real time, across its own runtime, while remaining apparently unaware that this is what it's doing. The state of the industry produced this failure. The filmmakers had the skill, but the film could not commit to its own argument, because committing to that argument would have required the studio to acknowledge something it was never going to acknowledge. That this sequel, in the specific form it took, is exactly the kind of creative compromise the original film was warning us about. Legacy sequels can succeed when they treat the passage of time as a storytelling engine. Top Gun: Maverick leaves Pete Mitchell well past the emotional baseline of 1986, and asks a genuinely difficult question. What happens to a man defined by instinct, recklessness, and a refusal to acknowledge his own mortality when he gets old? His guilt over Goose, the horror of passing the torch to the son of the man whose death he never fully processed, these are problems that became possible only because 36 years have passed. The weight of that time is the story. Creed and Blade Runner 2049 perform similar transformations. Rocky becomes a mentor confronting his own mortality. Deckard is found broken in the ruins of a world that has long since moved past whatever he was protecting. In each case, the filmmakers gave their characters new problems that emerged from their original growth, building forward from where the earlier films had left them. These films respect their audiences and trust them with grief and the weight of time. They trust that we can sit with characters who are no longer who they were and find that development genuinely interesting, deeply human, and emotionally true. The Devil Wears Prada 2 withheld that trust. Gave us Miranda glaring over her glasses, Andy stammering in the corridor, Emily brittle and hostile in the background, all the shapes of the original film pressed into new scenes doing the same work they did 20 years ago. All forms evacuative substance, the cinematic equivalent of Plato's cave. But we paid for it anyway. Audiences claim they want originality. We write think pieces about the death of the original IP. We celebrate the rare original film that breaks through. Then, The Devil Wears Prada 2 opens to $100 million. Nostalgia is real, and the original film was sharp and specific and honest about the cost of ambition in a way that most films about ambition can't be. The longing to return to that world is rational, the recognition of something that genuinely mattered. Revisiting a world honors what was made. Undoing that world erases it. Honoring a character preserves the choices they paid for. Resetting them voids the bill. Right now, we are paying Hollywood to confuse the two. This is a direct transaction. When we pay for a film that regresses its characters, we communicate to the industry that we just want the shape of something, not the substance. Hollywood is expert at reading financial signals. It receives the message and acts on it with efficiency. The next legacy sequel will be greenlit this week. The character will be reset. The arc will be erased. The nostalgia will be activated. This reset button trains us to accept the simulation of resonance as a substitute for resonance itself. The more we accept that substitution, the harder it becomes to recognize the difference. The 2006 film ended with Andy Sachs choosing herself. She chose discomfort, leaving prestige behind. She chose authenticity, leaving mastery behind. She chose the difficulty of being herself, leaving the easier and more lucrative project of becoming someone else where it stood. That choice, because of its specificity, its cost, and the completeness as a character decision, is what has kept that film alive for 2 decades. The 2026 film ended with a billionaire and a check. That tells you everything about what 20 years has cost us across this franchise, across this film, and across the relationship between the stories we make and the stories we deserve. Until we stop rewarding the reset button, characters like Andy Sachs will never be allowed to just walk away. They will be pulled back, stripped of their growth, placed back at the beginning, because the beginning is what we paid for, and the beginning is what we keep returning to. It's fine to want this, but I also think we're capable of wanting something better. Until we do, Hollywood will keep giving us exactly what we ask for, and what we're asking for is not a lot right now. If you're drawn to stories that challenge and inspire, subscribe and be part of the conversation. Thanks for watching, and stay copacetic.